Could you briefly touch on the vagus nerve and brainstem and how they might play a role in long COVID symptoms?
Sure. So we have a very important nerve that runs throughout most of our major organs and then connects to the back of the brain. And that nerve is called the vagus nerve. Vagus actually means wanderer. So the nerve is named because it wanders throughout our entire human body. So what happens is, again, like, it converges on every major trunk organ. So vagus nerve innervates the gut, it innervates the heart, it innervates all these important organs. And when it's there, it has receptors at the end terminals of the nerve that sense inflammation. And if they sense inflammation, they convey that signal to the brainstem, which is an area at the back of the brain. In that area of the brainstem, you can see this in that paper you mentioned, that 2021 paper, has these overlapping nerve bodies that control some very important responses or symptoms in people. One is the sickness behavior response, and that is a response that the brain mounts to let a person know that the body's sick. So let's say you have food poisoning, because you ate something, you're sick. Your brain has to know that that happened so that you stop eating the food poisoning food. So what happens is the vagus nerve is in the gut, senses the inflammation from the food poisoning and goes, it signals to the brainstem and it says, this is not good. You're sick, you're sick, you're sick. And that this nucleus in the brain signals symptoms of flu-like symptoms, malaise, tiredness, achiness, which are the manifestations of sickness. And that's what's the sickness behavior response. So you can understand that, let's say you had a problem in your gut, but it didn't go away. Let's say you have reservoir of the virus still in the gut, didn't fully clear. It could be then that the vagus nerve keeps sensing that inflammation and keeps signaling to the brainstem, and then keeps mounting that sickness behavior response with the fatigue and the malaise and the tiredness, and those symptoms continue in a person, which are some of the most common symptoms that people have with long COVID, right? So it helps kind of explain, if that were happening, why people feel fatigued and why they develop these symptoms of, malaise and fatigue. In the brainstem, near the same nerve region that controls that sickness response, there's also nerve bodies that control autonomic function, which is, in simple terms, modulates our ability to move from a sitting to a standing position without getting super dizzy. So we're able to make the blood pressure changes needed to get up and entirely change how we are. That's controlled by the autonomic nervous system. So we see, again, in patients with long COVID often that they struggle with that. So patients develop what's called dysautonomia, or problems where they cannot rise from sitting to standing without becoming incredibly dizzy. They have a lot of trouble regulating their blood pressure and autonomic function. So it makes sense that there could be issues with the autonomic signaling in the brainstem. And then there's also nerve bodies there that control pain and nausea. So overall, the big picture that we see is, we think that a lot of study in long COVID patients should be happening on vagus nerve, because that nerve connects to so many body sites and is able to influence those brain regions that control symptoms that are so common in many long COVID patients. And the way, again, that might happen is that the vagus nerve could be sensing, for example, persistent reservoirs of virus. And that could be one of the reasons that the nerve is changing its signaling and potentially being impacted to contribute to symptoms. Also, though, it's not impossible that the vagus nerve could be directly infected, for example, by SARS-CoV-2, maybe even in a persistent state. There was an autopsy study of patients with acute COVID, and they got vagus nerve tissue from people who passed away from COVID. And one team found SARS-CoV-2 RNA in every single vagus nerve sample from patients in that study, every single person. So the virus had gotten directly into that vagus nerve. So one thing, again, that we're trying to study and think about is, what if the virus is just in the vagus nerve? That would be the most straightforward explanation for why that sickness response and the autonomic symptoms and other symptoms were manifesting, at least in certain patients. So it's an interesting pathway that we're looking at highly in long COVID.